All right, welcome to the deep dive, where we take your curiosity, add a stack of fascinating sources, and then distill it all into the knowledge you're looking for. Maybe with a few surprises along the way. Think of this as your own personal exploration, guided by us into the material you shared.
So today we are going on a journey into the very intricate world of the human brain, specifically the contrasting but also beautifully interconnected roles of its two hemispheres, the left and the right.
Yeah, and to guide our journey, we have the insightful work of Iain McGilchrist. We'll be pulling from his really profound books, The Master and His Emissary and The Matter with Things, as well as some YouTube conversations where he unpacks these ideas in more sort of accessible ways.
Absolutely.
So what we are really hoping to get out of this deep dive is to understand how these two halves of our brain, often simplified into, this sort of left brain versus right brain thing, how they actually offer us different perspectives on reality itself.
Yeah.
And we're going to explore how these contrasting approaches shape how we perceive the world, how we understand information, the nature of creativity, and even how we interact with each other.
It's really quite profound.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we'll try to keep it approachable, so hopefully we can do this without too much in the way of dense academic jargon.
Okay.
So where do we even begin with something this complex?
Well, I think the best place to start is with, at the foundation of these differences, and that is the type of attention that each hemisphere brings to the world.
Okay.
McGilchrist really emphasizes that our attention isn't just this passive reception of information. It actively participates in shaping the reality that we experience.
So we're not just empty vessels being filled up. We are participating in the process.
Right. Think about it this way. What we choose to focus on actually influences what becomes real for us, what becomes salient.
So it's almost like our attention is like a creative force in a way, actively involved in bringing our experience of reality into being. That's kind of a powerful idea.
It is. It really is. And it's a very different stance from what McGilchrist sees as these extremes of either believing that reality is purely out there, completely objective, what we'd call naive realism,
Okay.
or that it's solely a creation of our own minds, this kind of like naive idealism, sometimes associated with like postmodernist thought.
Okay.
He suggests that both of those viewpoints, despite their differences, they both share this lack of respect for this interplay, that we are in a relationship, we are in a partnership with the world around us.
Okay, so it's not just us passively observing a world that's fixed and unchanging, but it's also not us just being able to conjure up whatever we want and having it be real. It's this kind of meeting in the middle, I guess, and our attention is the key.
It's a dance. It's a constant back and forth. And through those distinct ways of paying attention, the two hemispheres deliver what McGilchrist called fundamentally different versions of reality.
Versions of reality, okay.
They both offer unique strengths and approaches, which is why, evolutionarily, our brain has developed with these two interconnected but separate ways of being in the world.
Okay, so just to be clear, because, we always hear this sort of like shorthand of left brain versus right brain. It sounds like what we are actually talking about is much more nuanced than that. It's not like the left side is responsible for this and the right side is responsible for that.
You're absolutely right. It's much more nuanced. Both hemispheres are involved in almost all mental processes. They're constantly in dialogue, they're exchanging information back and forth multiple times every second.
Okay.
So the world we know is the synthesis. It's a product of their collaboration.
It's a partnership then.
Yes.
But it doesn't necessarily mean it's like a perfectly equal partnership at every moment.
Right. Exactly. And that's where things get interesting because this collaboration, as I said, it's often asymmetrical.
Okay.
So at any given time, one hemisphere's version of reality tends to have more of a dominant influence on our conscious experience.
Okay.
And while we should, we want to be careful about assigning like simplistic personalities to each side.
Right.
There are consistent, I guess, preferences that we see for one hemisphere over the other when it comes to certain activities.
I really like that analogy you used earlier about sort of like one being the master and one being the emissary. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So, McGilchrist uses this analogy, as you said, of like a master and an emissary, or a king and his counselor, to really kind of highlight this idea that it's not a symmetrical relationship. It's not like, equals sort of, in a corporation working together. One holds a position of primacy, One is sort of offering this overarching wisdom or direction, while the other serves by, bringing in a different but essential perspective, carrying out the specific tasks.
Okay, I see. So it's not just that they are doing different things, they actually have different roles in their relationship.
Exactly. It's a hierarchy.
Okay. So let's delve into the specifics of each hemisphere a little bit. So when we start with the left hemisphere, what's its primary way of sort of engaging with the world?
So the left hemisphere, as McGilchrist describes it, it tends towards grabbing, representing, and then analyzing.
Grabbing.
Yes.
Okay.
And language is a prime example of this. It has a larger vocabulary, it has more intricate grammatical structures, and this really enhances our ability to create these maps of the world through words and explore those cause and effect relationships that we love to find.
Okay, so it really is that side of language. But it sounds like it's even deeper than that. It's not just that it's the language center of the brain. Its role in language is telling us something about how it sees the world in general.
It really is. McGilchrist argues that its superiority in language stems from it being the hemisphere of representation.
Okay.
So what it does is it substitutes symbols,
Okay.
whether it's spoken words or even, and this is interesting, visual symbols, because sign language is actually processed primarily in the left hemisphere, not the right.
Really?
Yeah, it substitutes these for that direct lived experience.
Okay, so it's like it's creating a map of the world instead of actually experiencing the world directly.
It's making a representation, right?
Okay,
It's giving us a model, a way of understanding. But, and I think this is crucial, especially in our increasingly, data-driven world, it's crucial to remember that the map is not the territory.
Right, and it's easy to forget that when you have a really detailed map.
Exactly.
And how does this sort of representational mode affect how the left hemisphere sees other things, like our bodies, for example?
Well, it tends to classify and see the body as almost like an assemblage of separate parts, like a machine made up of individual components. And this can, have some really interesting, even kind of striking manifestations. There are documented cases, of individuals who have had right hemisphere strokes.
Right.
And because of the left hemisphere's dominance now, they might actually deny ownership of a limb that isn't functioning as it expects it to.
Wow. So it's like literally a disconnect between their experience and their sense of self because of how the left hemisphere is interpreting the situation.
It is. It can be very alienating.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, so then what about the left hemisphere's approach to information and knowledge in general?
So the left hemisphere, it really favors this linear, step-by-step, analysis. It loves logic. It's driven by a need for certainty, for this very explicit, clearly stated knowledge. It's that's what it says right here, mentality.
Okay.
And its measure of truth is often internal consistency and coherence within that system of representation, that map that it's created. Sometimes even if that system doesn't perfectly align with the reality that lies beyond it, the territory.
So it gets so focused on the map that it may miss what's actually going on in the territory itself.
Precisely.
Okay.
And this can lead to a sort of virtual reality, a representation that it sometimes mistakes for the actual presence of something.
Okay.
McGilchrist even introduces this concept of an interpreter within the left hemisphere.
An interpreter, what does that even mean?
Right. You can think of it like this storyteller.
Okay.
Right. The left hemisphere is trying to make sense of the information it has, even if that information is incomplete or maybe even wrong. And so it creates this narrative, a plausible sounding narrative, but it can lead us astray.
Okay.
We might be following a story that is not quite reflecting what's really going on.
So it's good at creating stories, good at creating systems, but it may not always be in touch with the truth. Okay, so, it sounds like this mode of processing, while it's obviously incredibly powerful for certain things, detailed analysis, for example, but it also seems like it could lead to a somewhat fragmented view of the world. Like, it's almost like a show or representation, but it's lost touch with our sort of intuitive lived experience.
And historically, this left hemisphere dominant mode has been very influential in philosophy.
Yeah, and that makes sense.
Perhaps because of its tools, the clear language that it uses and this linear way of thinking. But I think, to your point, there is a risk of becoming too analytic, leading to a world that is viewed only in disconnected parts.
Okay, so now let's shift gears. Let's turn our attention to the right hemisphere. What does it primarily focus on?
Well, if the left hemisphere likes to break things down and analyze, The right hemisphere is much more attuned to novelty, to the bigger picture, to context, to the immediate experience of being present.
Yeah.
And this plays out in our social lives as well as in our understanding and expression of emotions. It processes things like facial expressions, the tone of voice, what we call prosody,
Yeah.
and even gestures. It's really paying attention to those nonverbal cues.
So it's picking up the emotional atmosphere of a situation more than the literal content of what's being said.
Yeah, and its approach is much more global and holistic. It's not breaking things down into individual features. It's seeing the whole pattern,
Okay.
So think about instantly recognizing a friend's face, even in a crowded room.
Right, right. It's not like you're listing off their features and saying, okay, yep, that's definitely them.
It's this immediate recognition of the whole. And this actually plays into language as well, which is interesting because we typically think of language as being a left hemisphere function.
Right, right.
So while the left hemisphere might be handling that explicit content, the words themselves,
Okay.
the right hemisphere is specialized in what we call pragmatics,
Pragmatics, okay.
which is the understanding of meaning within a specific context.
Okay.
So it's really crucial for grasping things like metaphors
Okay.
and humor, which often relies on this kind of shift in context or unexpected interpretations. And this is why the left hemisphere, with its literal interpretations, can sometimes really struggle with things like sarcasm or implied meanings.
So it's like the right hemisphere is reading between the lines, picking up on the unspoken aspects of communication. Okay, I see what you mean.
Exactly. It's got that bigger picture, sense. It's also, the right hemisphere has this much more, a denser and direct connection to the body, grounding us in the immediacy of experience. And so, unlike the left hemisphere, which tends to view the body as this collection of separate parts, the right hemisphere perceives it as an integral aspect of ourselves, that we live in it.
We live in it.
Yeah, not just inhabit it.
Okay, so the felt sense of the body versus, the anatomical diagram of the body.
That's a great way to put it.
That's a huge difference. Earlier you were talking about different ways of knowing, and you mentioned these two German words. I found that really, really interesting. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure, yeah. McGilchrist uses the terms kennen and wissen.
Kennen and wissen. Okay.
So wissen is that kind of like knowing facts, the kind of explicit factual knowledge that the left hemisphere excels at.
Okay.
That's what it says in the
Oh,
book.
like book knowledge.
Textbook knowledge, yeah.
Okay.
Kennen, on the other hand, is knowing through direct experience. This is associated with the right hemisphere.
Okay.
And the example he gives is, think about knowing a piece of music. You might wissen the notes. You know the composer. You know the historical period. That's all factual information. But you kennen the music by listening to it, by feeling it, by experiencing it directly, much like you can in a person through shared experiences, through understanding their character, not just knowing their name and their job title.
Right, right. It's like the difference between knowing about someone and actually knowing them.
Precisely.
Okay.
Okay.
And it seems like music really speaks to this. It's not just a bunch of notes. It's an experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the right hemisphere seems to play this really central role in that experience, likely being, its evolutionary origin, as this fundamental form of communication that actually predates spoken language.
Predates spoken language.
Yeah, music, it conveys emotion directly.
Okay.
It's this whole body experience, this very holistic communication.
Okay. So we've got this theme merging with the right hemisphere. It's about connection to our bodies, to other people, to the world around us. It's seeing the bigger picture.
You got it.
Yeah.
It has this natural tendency to see the connectedness of things, to engage with the world in this participatory way,
Okay.
and to experience empathy. And actually, there's even an anatomical correlate to this. Empathy seems to be linked to increased activity in the right frontal lobe.
Interesting. Okay.
And McGilchrist also contrasts the left hemisphere's kind of wanting, which is this very kind of direct impulse towards something that is seen as separate and inert,
Okay.
with the right hemisphere's longing, which is this attraction towards something that isn't wholly separate. It's imbued with this sense of kind of betweenness, this sense of connection.
It almost sounds like, I don't know, like a recognition of the shared humanity in a way, or shared existence, something like
Yeah,
that.
it's this, yeah.
Okay. So much more nuanced than just wanting something. It's almost like this, I don't know, this yearning for connection.
Yeah, and he sees the right hemisphere as being deeply rooted in primary experience, the immediate, the present moment. And what's really fascinating is that it seems capable of taking the information that the left hemisphere has, so carefully analyzed and represented
Right.
and integrating it back into something that feels living and meaningful.
Okay.
It reconstitutes it.
It puts it all back together.
It puts it all back together, exactly. It also shows superior ability in tasks that require this broader scope of attention, this ability to make connections between seemingly unrelated things, which, as you know, is crucial for creativity, and even something as simple as the preference for vertical lines in writing and reading from top to bottom might be linked to this holistic top-down processing style of the right hemisphere
Okay.
versus the left hemisphere, which tends to go in a linear fashion, left to right.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
What about something like our sense of self, our own identity? How does the right hemisphere factor into that?
Yeah, the right hemisphere seems to be really crucial in our sense of self, this continuous feeling of being the same person over time.
Right.
And also the immediate experiential self in the present moment, that just feeling of being.
Okay.
It's interesting because certain types of visual distortions, what's called metamorphopsia, and even auditory hallucinations, are often associated with damage to or dysfunction in the right side of the brain, suggesting that it plays a key role in maintaining a stable sense of ourselves and the world around us.
Okay.
And the right hemisphere also tends to have a more realistic, though sometimes maybe a more pessimistic view of our own capabilities.
Okay.
It's the one that brings us back down to earth a little bit.
So it's not just about, the rose-colored glasses.
Exactly, yeah. And it's also crucial for those moments of insight, when we suddenly see a problem in a new way. And it's really good at set shifting, being able to change perspectives when we're trying to solve a problem.
Okay.
It's almost like the devil's advocate. It's the one that's constantly seeking counterexamples, ensuring that our understanding is aligning with the external world and not just getting caught up in our own internal logic.
It's like a reality check in a way.
Yeah, it's very grounded, and its understanding of truth is different from the left.
Okay.
It's based on what's called correspondence. How faithfully does our understanding match something outside of ourselves? And in art, it's the right hemisphere that allows for the direct communication of human qualities. Art can affect us almost like a real human encounter. And it provides us with our natural viewpoint of the world, although it can get a little bit stuck if it becomes too dominant, too focused on just the everyday reality.
Okay. So it's great at grounding us, but it needs the left hemisphere to help us see things in new ways and create new things and that sort of thing.
Precisely. It needs that balance.
Right. Okay, so we have these two hemispheres. They both seem to be valuable. They do different things. But what happens when they're not working together in that balanced, integrated way?
Well, I think that's when things can become problematic. McGilchrist, he really stresses that the left hemisphere needs to return what it has so carefully analyzed and represented back to the right hemisphere in order for it to be, I guess, truly alive, to be embedded in that wider context of our lived experience. So in essence, the left hemisphere, for all its kind of cleverness and its power of analysis, depends on the right for meaning and grounding.
It's interesting because it kind of brings us back to that master and emissary analogy. What are the dangers of that relationship?
Right, yeah. So the right hemisphere is the master in this analogy. It's the one providing this overarching wisdom, the holistic understanding, that sense of value, of purpose. And then you have the left hemisphere, which is the emissary, intended to serve by, carrying out its specific tasks, doing the analysis, creating the representations.
Okay.
The danger arises when the emissary, so caught up in the details, in its efficiency, starts to believe that it knows better than the master.
Okay.
And then tries to usurp the master's role.
Oh, I see.
It leads to this very distorted, fragmented view of reality.
Just lost the forest for the trees.
Exactly, yeah.
It's interesting to think about, we know that there was this period of really rapid expansion of the human brain in early, hominids. How do you think that might have played into this dynamic between the hemispheres?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And McGilchrist actually proposes that the development of imitation, which is this crucial meta skill, it enabled rapid adaptation, cooperation, things that we associate with the right hemisphere. He thinks that paradoxically it arose from that more sort of individualistic, selfish gene drive that we associate with the left hemisphere.
Okay.
So it's almost like this, it's a double-edged sword in a way,
Okay.
because this ability to imitate, to learn from others, it could have fueled that really rapid evolutionary progress and allowed us to, in a sense, to choose who we become through learning and adopting new behaviors.
Right.
But it also, created that potential for the emissary to get a little bit too big for its britches, to start thinking it knows better.
I see. Okay. So then what happens when this balance between the hemispheres gets disrupted? Like, what are the consequences?
Well, McGilchrist actually, he points out that this imbalance in hemispheric function seems to be a common thread in a lot of different mind-brain conditions.
Okay.
Things like right hemisphere dysfunction, schizophrenia, autism. There are interesting overlaps in the way that individuals with these conditions experience the world, suggesting that there might be some underlying issue with how we're connecting with and making sense of reality.
So that's really interesting. There's this common thread.
Right.
Okay. How might that kind of imbalance show up in our everyday life?
Yeah, so if the right hemisphere's contribution is consistently undervalued or neglected,
Okay.
it can lead to a world that just feels strangely devoid of meaning,
Okay.
where things seem insubstantial. They lack that kind of vibrancy.
Okay.
And in more extreme cases, it can even result in these delusional misidentification syndromes.
Delusional misidentification syndromes. Okay.
Where people, might feel that familiar places or even loved ones have been replaced by imposters. It's like their left hemisphere is creating this story
Right.
that doesn't match up with their actual experience.
And because it doesn't have that grounding in the right hemisphere, the felt sense of the world, it's ungrounded.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. That's pretty profound.
It is.
You mentioned an example earlier using syllogisms, those logical arguments.
Right.
And I thought it was a really good illustration of this potential imbalance. Could you walk us through that again?
Yeah, so a syllogism is kind of a logical argument. You have these premises and then a conclusion that's supposed to follow from the premises.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that if you give people syllogisms where the premises are obviously false,
Okay.
but they lead to a logically consistent conclusion,
Okay.
the right hemisphere tends to recognize the absurdity of it.
Okay.
It says, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense in terms of my experience of the world. But the left hemisphere, prioritizing that internal logical consistency, that's what the rules say, will often endorse that false conclusion.
Okay, so it's sticking to the rules of the game.
Exactly, even when it leads to a result that doesn't correspond to reality.
Okay, that's really interesting. It seems like this left hemisphere strength, being able to create systems, can also be a potential weakness if it loses touch with the bigger picture.
It can be blind spot. And McGilchrist even points out that, even these very highly rational systems, they can contain inherent limitations and paradoxes. He even brings up Gödel's incompleteness theorem,
Okay.
which demonstrates that within any formal system that's complex enough to describe arithmetic, there are always going to be true statements that can't be proven within that system.
Okay, so even with our best attempts at creating these perfectly logical systems,
Right.
we're always going to run into these limitations.
Always. There's this inherent tension between certainty and knowledge.
So the more we try to define things, categorize things with this absolute certainty,
Right.
the more we actually might be missing.
Exactly. And there's also this, a tendency for the left hemisphere to view the right hemisphere's more holistic, experience-based perspective as a challenge to its supremacy.
Yeah, like it's almost threatened by it, I guess.
It wants to be in control.
Okay. So with all of this in mind,
Hmm.
how does this understanding of hemispheric differences relate to our listeners?
Yeah.
Who are really interested in knowledge, but in a way that's both quick and thorough. They like multiple perspectives. They love those aha moments. But they don't want to get bogged down in the weeds.
Well, I think understanding these contrasting modes of processing, it gives us this powerful new lens to interpret information and experiences. So, when you encounter different viewpoints on a topic,
Okay.
different approaches to a problem, you can start to think about, well, which hemispheric mode might be more dominant here?
Okay.
Is this a very left hemisphere analytical approach, or is it a more right hemisphere holistic approach?
Yeah.
And this framework can really shed light on the nature of creativity as well.
Okay.
Where you need that interplay, right? You need the right hemisphere's ability to make those broad connections, those unexpected leaps.
Okay.
But you also need the left hemisphere's ability to to implement and articulate those ideas.
So it really is about that balance.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it can even offer insights into communication,
Okay.
helping us to appreciate both the explicit verbal language, but also that more implicit contextual understanding that the right hemisphere is so good at.
Okay, so it's not just about accumulating facts. It's about understanding how we know things
Exactly.
and how those ways of knowing are shaping the reality that we perceive. And it sounds like if we can become more aware of these potential imbalances, both in ourselves and in the world around us,
Yeah.
then we can kind of move towards a more integrated, and ultimately a more nuanced understanding.
You put it beautifully. It's not about choosing one over the other.
Right.
It's about understanding the value of both and appreciating that, within each of us, there's this intricate, vital dance between the master and the emissary.
Okay, so as we bring this deep dive into the world of the brain, the divided brain, to a close, what's the one key takeaway that you want our listener to walk away with?
I think it would be to really appreciate the crucial and often underestimated role of the right hemisphere.
Okay.
In grounding our experience of reality and understanding meaning, in fostering connection, and the importance of its interplay, a balanced, respectful interplay with the left hemisphere's strengths.
Okay.
The right hemisphere is not just this, silent partner.
Okay.
It's absolutely fundamental to how we perceive, understand, and interact with everything around us.
It's a dance.
It is.
Okay. Well, on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider that kind of builds on what we've been talking about today.
Okay.
Think about a challenge you might be facing right now.
Yeah.
Or an area that you're really interested in your life. And ask yourself, how might Colent becoming more aware of your own attentional biases,
Okay.
how you tend to focus your attention, how you tend to think about things, and the mode of processing that you tend to favor.
Okay.
How might that actually be shaping how you're seeing that situation?
Yeah.
Iain McGilchrist, he draws inspiration from William Blake,
Right.
who talks about cleansing the doors of perception.
Yes.
And we didn't really get into Blake today.
Right.
But think about that idea of cleansing,
Yeah.
of maybe consciously shifting how you're paying attention, and then how that might actually influence your understanding.
Yeah.
Perhaps even reveal a different version of reality, a richer one
Yeah.
than what you're currently experiencing.
It's a beautiful way to put it.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive as much as we did.
Yeah.
And until next time, happy exploring.
See you then.